How do you cope with feelings of hopelessness and an urge to isolate? For many trauma survivors, feeling isolated and hopeless is a daily occurrence. These feelings are really hard to shake off, and they can leave a mark for many years after the relationship even ends. One of the most challenging parts of my own healing journey is avoiding that urge to isolate because, quite frankly, I tend to feel safer when I am on my own. But the truth is, it would be unrealistic and unhealthy for me if I were to live the rest of my days locked inside a room without talking to anyone else ever again. And this week, I will be joined by Benjamin Allen, who happens to be the first guest who ever came on Hello Trauma Brain. Ben is going to be sharing with me what happened with his own podcast called The Complex PTSD Guy, and he will also share a tool he has found helpful to combat hopelessness and feelings of boredom. Ben and I also reflect on realizing how everyone is not necessarily like our abusers, the importance of keeping our brains from sabotaging us, the challenges of setting and maintaining boundaries, and so much more. Hi, I am Raysa, a survivor of narcissistic abuse, and I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And you are listening to Hello Trauma Brain, a podcast where I share my experiences living with complex PTSD. My hope is this podcast can help destigmatize mental illness and provide support to anyone diagnosed with C-PTSD who thinks they might have it or has a loved one with this diagnosis. Quick reminder, I am not a licensed psychologist or mental health care professional, and this podcast is not meant to replace nor substitute the care of psychologists, other mental or medical health care professionals. If you think you might have complex PTSD or any of the conditions mentioned in this podcast, please reach out to your primary care or mental health care provider. Any individuals or resources mentioned in this episode are not sponsoring Hello Trauma Brain. This episode may reference trauma or abuse, and listener discretion is advised. Remember, you can always pause or skip this episode at any time. And now, let's get back to the episode. Hello, dear survivors, and welcome to this episode of Hello Trauma Brain. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you are listening on YouTube, a gentle reminder to hit the like button to let me know this episode was helpful. So quick check-in. It's been a little overwhelming. My inner kiddo is definitely having a day today where there's a lot of anxiety, and I can pinpoint a few triggers. I think the warmer weather is a bit of a trigger for me. It's a little weird, but I think as the days get nicer, I start dreading the possibility of things going very wrong. Though I love to feel joy and it's wonderful, the reality is my brain tends to kick me off feelings of joy very quickly, and it uses things like OCD or catastrophizing or focusing on potential things that could go wrong in the future to distract me from feeling joyful. And this few days have not been the exception to that, even though I am trying really hard to work on sitting with joy for as long as I can and trying to come back to it even when my brain is trying to kick me out of feeling joyful. So all that aside, I'm going to wrap up my check-in right there and jump right into talking about this week's episode. So Ben is joining me back on the podcast. He used to have a podcast called The Complex PTSD Guy, and today he's going to be talking a little bit about what happened, his podcast did and abruptly back in the summer of 2024, and he did not get a chance to explain what happened. So Ben is going to be able to address things for any of you that are listeners of his podcast. You'll finally get some insight into what happened exactly. Few things to note. I recorded this episode before I upgraded my microphones, so you will notice a difference in the quality in my audio, and that's why. Also, we recorded that episode way back, and I was actually in the middle of a pretty heavy snowstorm the day we recorded. So basically, the recording we made does have some technical and connectivity issues, and I try to edit as much as I could. Mostly the issue was you can hear some of my echo through Ben's computer, and there were some times where his audio you can kind of hear it glitching, and maybe I am over focusing on it and nobody realizes it. But in case any of you do hear some of the connectivity issues, it's not your device. It was just we recorded during a storm, and it is what it is. Another thing to note is that this is part one of our conversation, and next week I will release the final part two with the rest of my conversation with Ben. And now, without further delay, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Benjamin Allen. All right, dear survivors, I would like to welcome back to the podcast Benjamin Allen. He is a 42-year-old historian and licensed massage therapist who for years had a part-time podcasting about living with complex PTSD, which he likes to think of as his diary that you get to eavesdrop on. His podcast is called The Complex PTSD Guy. Ben was diagnosed with complex PTSD in 2017 and started podcasting about living with complex PTSD in January of 2020. Ben is not only Hello Trauma Brain's first guest, but has now become our first returning guest. So I am very thrilled for you all to see Ben return back to Hello Trauma Brain. Ben, welcome back. Thank you so much for doing this. How are you feeling today?
Thanks for having me, Raysa. I feel great today. I feel really good, and I'll let you ask some more questions, but I will explain to some of my listeners who might be listening to your podcast what happened with mine because I had some technical issues back in like July of 2024, and I was never able to figure them out. So, like you said, I'm a more of a historian and a massage therapist. I never went to school for podcasting.
Actually, I think that's a good place to start talking a little bit about what has happened since we last spoke in the podcast and what have you been up to?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. The last podcast I did, which I think was like July 10th or something, or July 6th, I don't remember. But the topic of that podcast was really interesting for it to be my last episode unexpectedly. Um, so the reason it was my last was I updated my phone like I normally do every week or two. And when I woke up the next day, I tried to get onto my podcast and everything looked different. All the settings were different. It said normally whenever I record an episode it's very easy to do, and this was having me, it just was like a maze. I just wasn't able to figure it out, but I was able to see all my old episodes thankfully because I do think of my podcast almost as a diary. But the last episode I did I thought was so interesting because if you listen to what I was talking about on that episode and the episode before it, I was talking about I didn't name who the person was. It's a celebrity, but there was a celebrity who was belittling their kid, and it really bothered me. And I had actually talked about this celebrity before and sort of the way that they go about doing certain things in their life and how I see certain patterns that reminded me of people in my life. And then when they did what they did to their kid, I thought, oh my gosh, they're doing the same thing that is familiar to what I grew up with, and it irked me a lot. It really bothered me. They referred to their own 5-year-old child as a half-wit, and they were mocking the fact that they had a reading problem. And I was like, man, this is so bad. And they were doing it on a radio program, their own radio program. But it just really, and they were making light of it. They were joking about it. And I just thought that's so bad. But that ironically was my last episode because I've talked on my podcast a lot about that very thing. And ironically, that was my last episode, and I felt like I was trying to stand up for the kid, but I wasn't going to name who this parent was. But I just felt like I wish someone would speak up for this 5-year-old because you don't mock a 5-year-old's reading problem and call him a halfwit. And it was very ironic, and the fact that that was my last episode, I thought that's almost very symbolic that I finish off with something like that, and I felt like I took a tiny little stand, and it made me feel good that, well, that might be my last episode, so there you go. But it made me happy I did it because I thought normally I don't do things like that. I don't normally speak up for people I don't even know. I've never met those people, but I was like, well, at least did a tiny little speak out for, a kid, but it was right at the heart of everything. It was right there. It was witnessing, I would say verbal, maybe not verbal abuse, but it's like verbal um, pecking. You're pecking at a kid, and that can lead to a lot of problems.
Yeah, I actually remember that episode, and I thought it was such a brave and important thing to do, and I hope that kid at one point, it might probably won't be right now, but like later on they can run into that episode.
That would be amazing. The really weird thing, because I kind of went off on a tangent on that episode, but the kid has the same name as me. I won't say what his last name is, but he had the same first and middle name. And I was like, I don't know very many kids named Benjamin Allen, but I just thought that was odd. And strangely, and not to sound weird, he looks a lot like me too. When I was 4, I saw a picture of him when he's 4. He's only a 5, but when he was like 4, I have a picture from when I was 4, and it's like a duplicate. And I was like, this is just giving me weird vibes because he's being treated the same way and he's the same name. And I just thought there's something very eerie about it. And I was glad I actually didn't talk more about it because it really got my attention. I'll just put it that way. Because I don't normally speak up, but if someone is being, I would say, almost verbally picked on, by their own parent, and then and their parents' friends think it's fine. You know what I mean? Because the parent has found friends that think it's fine. That's the problem. Because when I was growing up, the person that abused me, they surrounded themselves with people who thought the abuse was okay, and that's very typical. So then you grow up in this sort of dark void where you think it's normal that you're being abused because whoever is abusing you, that's their friends are okay with it because no one's saying anything, right?
Right.
Nobody's speaking up because your abuser has surrounded themselves with people like that. So anyway,
Yeah, no, you're on the money about that. And part of the issue with parents that do this with their kids, I consider it abusive because it's like really like inserting that toxic shame into their self-esteem.
yeah,
And to be surrounded by people that are not calling it off, like that's why that episode is so important because you're so right. Like it is not okay. Like a 4 year old, a 5 year old to be hearing that from the person that's supposed to be their role model, their caretaker, that's very painful and it's very abusive. And I thought that it was so powerful that you stood up for them like that.
yeah, they were being very short, and I could tell they were kind of angry about it. And I was
Mm,
thinking they're like venting their anger, that their
mm,
kid has a reading struggle, and maybe the
mm,
parent is actually maybe the parent thinks they're the problem, so they're
mm.
mad that they're not parenting right, so they're just taking it out on the kid. But it's like you just need to sit and read with them and just talk out words. Like don't call them a half wit, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Like children that have like when children are developing, like we all have those times during our development where we're struggling with something, and someone who has a reading disability or any challenges, like kids need help from their adults. They don't need to be mocked by those adults.
Yeah,
Like I'm with you. Like sitting down with that child and being like, what do we need to do to help you, as opposed to mocking you on a public forum nonetheless. Like that alone to me is just like very cringy. I wanted to circle back also to how you were explaining how your podcast came to, we'll call it like an abrupt end, because you didn't even know at the time when you were doing that episode that would have essentially become the last one you would do for now. It's yeah, that platform change, I remember hearing from that, hearing about that change. And I know a lot of other users have been quite discontent with how the settings changed. And it's a shame because at first I thought you were going on a hiatus because I took a summer hiatus. I was like, oh, maybe he's just taking a hiatus over the summer. But then when it didn't return, I reached out recently to find out what happened. And if anyone here is a listener of Ben's podcast, now you get a little bit of an explanation of what went down. It wasn't really planned. It just kind of organically happened.
and the other thing is I've said before on my own podcast, I'm someone that I like things to be explained. So when something doesn't make sense, that's a trigger for me because I've always talked about feelings of incompetence and how those are just feelings. And if things are just explained, it'll all make sense. That actually happened earlier today to me too, with a different subject matter. But so if my listeners aren't getting an explanation, and I'm someone who would always say, okay, my podcast might go on the fritz, or or on the skits or whatever you call it. My podcast might fuzz out, or I might be having issues in the next few days, so bear with me. But I didn't say any of that because I had no idea that was going to happen. So my first thought was, oh my gosh, my listeners are probably going to think something's wrong, like something happened to me, or or where did he go, or what happened. There was just no explanation. So that was my first thought was, man, I wish that I had known something was coming, but nothing. I didn't know.
Yeah, that's it's very unfortunate, and I have to say, like that fear you have, like that's kind of what my experience was. Like at first, I was like, oh, he took a hiatus probably, and then I eventually I was like, okay, did something happen to him? And I'm lucky enough, I do have your email. I was able to reach out to you, and I'm glad I did because I you
Mhm.
wanted to have the opportunity to explain what happened here, and I was more than happy to provide that platform. So I wanted to add a little bit of a highlight to that piece that you just brought into the puzzle in terms of it can be a big trigger for people with complex PTSD to have something happen and that thing not get addressed and not get explained, because I feel like in scenarios where complex PTSD gets created, the system, there's a lot of secrets and a lot of, like, nobody talks about what's happening, and even though there's a big pink elephant in the room, everybody acts like it's not even there. I was wondering, like, when that happened, like, how did you cope with those feelings that you were having in terms of, like, people are going to think something is wrong and I cannot do anything about it right now.
I mostly just thought, this stuff probably happens a lot where people know that people have technology issues. And I've said before on my podcast, I'm not a tech wizard. I'm not a tech person. I'm not on any social media. I don't even have Facebook. So I'm like more of a simple guy with a podcast. So the way I dealt with it was I just said to myself, well, maybe it's for the best. And that's how I looked at it, was maybe it was for the best.
That makes sense. And I do want to point out to anyone listening, whether you've listened to Ben's podcast or if Ben's podcast is new for you, the podcast is still available out there. You can still listen and go back and go through that journey. And the podcast aired for a few years, so there's quite a bit of episodes there that I think are going to be very helpful to anyone looking for similar content.
Hmm.
I did want to ask you, Ben, since the podcast ended, it's been a few months, and I know that was a place where you would share tools that you were using. Are there any tools that you've come across since then that you'd like to share today?
One is new, and it ties back into what I had shared on my show before. So, one big issue, and I think that this definitely relates to complex PTSD. One thing that I think a lot of people do when you have complex PTSD, long term trauma, is we run to whatever feels safe. And sometimes that can just mean we run and rerun and rerun and we isolate. And a part of that's a really big problem, by the way, isolating. But a big part of that is boredom. And even if you work two jobs like I do, and you exercise like I do, and you try to stay busy and, talk to people, there can still be that boredom. And if you have been running and running and isolating, I did recently come across some books that fell into what I call the cure for boredom. So I have searched for something to help with, even if it's a half an hour of boredom, that can be almost detrimental to me because I overthink and then I get depressed. Having what I call a cure for boredom, which I talked about on my podcast several times, what worked for me was to go to the library, and this could work at any public library. I guess you could do it online in a certain way if you wanted to, but going from, and it only worked in nonfiction, by the way. It didn't work with fiction, because with fiction books, you do need to read the whole book to know the story. But with nonfiction, it's a book of facts, or it's a book of information. And so with what I call the cure for boredom is to go shelf by shelf, starting on the first shelf in nonfiction, and just check out like 3 books every couple weeks or 3 to 5 books. But look who wrote that book and why they wrote the book before you check it out and see if it's something that generally interests you. But go through it and skim through it and don't read the whole book. I always tell people I don't read the whole book, but learn one key bit of information from the book. So your brain is picking up factual information and it's getting your brain out of all that emotional thinking. So if you're reading real facts and you're reading something maybe you've never read about before, you're getting your mind out of all that emotional jumping down rabbit holes and all that stuff and thinking woe is me or thinking hard on yourself. You're getting yourself into a factual book of nonfiction and you're learning something new. And it has really helped. I've talked to counselors about it and they've even recommended it to their clients, because a lot of people struggle with not just boredom, but feeling hopeless, I think falls into that category, and also feeling empty or feeling like there's nothing new, you're tired of everything. This has helped, and I'm still doing that. So when you ask, is there something new? Yes. So there's 2 books. I just wanted to tell your listeners because these have really helped. So if you do run away a lot, and these are not books that I'm associated with, or I didn't write these books, these are just books that I came across doing that reading that I do at the library. But if you have a tendency to run away from problems because you're afraid of them, you're afraid of addressing people, or you're afraid of addressing something that terrifies you, one book, and the title of the book is probably going to make you laugh, but the book is called Who Moved My Cheese? And this is what it looks like. But it's Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. He's an MD. And the book, it's I wouldn't call it childlike, but it's all about moving with life. So when life throws you an obstacle, rather than running from it, you address it. And then once you address it, you realize, oh my gosh, this actually wasn't as scary as what I thought it was going to be. Or, oh my gosh, these people's responses weren't what I thought their responses would be. I'm so pleasantly surprised because I finally dealt with my problem. So, one little thing that they have is the more important your cheese is to you, the more you want to hold on to it. This character analyzed the situation over and over, and eventually his complicated brain with its huge belief system took hold. It's almost like the character thinks everything is kind of like dangerous or threatening, but then once they figure out that things change in life, that's why it's called Who Moved My Cheese. And if you move along with it, you're more likely to, you're just going to be happier rather than thinking, oh my gosh, someone took my cheese and I'm going to sit here and pout about it for 20 years because now I don't have my cheese anymore. And they're just using cheese as like a metaphor. This is another book that I came across. And the reason I'm mentioning these 2 books are these are books I've gone back to. These aren't just books that I came across in the last week. These are books that I came across several months ago, probably in September. And they're books that I keep realizing these are things that I need to keep going back to because with complex PTSD, the running away and the isolating, it almost makes these things, it makes you forget these things. So, like the fact that somebody might, like they say in the book, move your cheese. Like it's going to be moved. That's what happens in life. Someone's going to move your cheese and make you mad. But it's showing you how to address it and how you're actually going to feel better once you do. And then the other book is How High Can You Bounce? Turn Your Setbacks into Comebacks by Roger Crawford. That's what the book looks like. But this book, again, this goes back to running from your problems, and I've already explained like how that ties in with complex PTSD. A lot of that is fear. And by the way, whenever we run from our problems, that's your amygdala. That's the part of your brain that is saying run, run, run. It's just saying get away from it when really that's irrational, and it's irrational to just want to run from everything. But your brain doesn't know that. Your brain just sees this scares me. I want to get away from this. But we really, I think with complex PTSD, and I'm not a doctor, but I think we have a tendency to be irrational. And then we get very emotional and we get very depressed. So these books are kind of helping be more rational. But in chapter 6 of this book, It's called Seize Responsibility, Pay Yourself First. This book really gets into things that I normally wouldn't want to do, but it's showing you why it's good to do these things. Like take responsibility for something that maybe you're wanting to run from, and also being reliable for other people. And it could be anything in your whole life, just anything. Just pick something to be reliable about. And the goodness that comes out of that for you and other people, but for you, it's like you're building just a safer place for yourself when you can be more reliable. But these are just two things.
Thank you for sharing those. I want to add on into the isolation that you're talking about because in my experience it's like running away and isolating is like the name of my game. I've been working like I've been doing a therapy modality where I am learning how to do conflict with people. It's almost like for me like that's the bear. Like when you're talking about the amygdala, like that's why it feels like hell because for me, historically speaking, confronting someone who was abusing me about how they made me feel did not go well. It was dangerous.
Yeah.
So I still definitely carry that into today. And even with people that are completely different, not them at all, I still in the back of my head, I know when I'm bringing up something as small as it can be, my brain is going like, do not fucking go there.
Hmm.
And going against that impulse and still saying the thing, it's so big.
You're spot on. That's exactly right. And just like when we started talking, I talked about that kid. So that's why I spoke up. Because it's building in his brain, oh my God, if I fail at this, everyone's going to make fun of me because that's what his dad was doing, right? So they're going to say I'm a half-wit or they're going to, mock me for it. So it's almost like it's building it up, right? And, nobody wants that. So it's like once we can realize that there's a rational way, because really his parent is being irrational by calling his kid a name. The parent's actually the problem in the situation. The kid is fine. The kid is a kid. He just needs help with reading, right?
Exactly.
But it's the same with growing up with trauma. It was the abuser that had the problem. The abuser had the problem, and then they affected us with their problem, with their abuse. It's the whole being rational. When your brain is saying run, 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 and that's what you want to do, these two books really help with that because they're showing you what you get out of not running and being reliable, and also what it means to basically live life, which is the book Who Moved My Cheese. It's titled An Amazing Way to Deal with Change in Your Work and in Your Life. And that's just life. Everything, things change. You said it exactly right. We don't sometimes want to address things because our brain is telling us to not do that. But once we do it, we'll be very pleasantly surprised most of the time. Most people are not like our dysfunctional abusers. Most people are not like that. And so every time I finally address something with someone who's not my abuser, I'm just baffled at how wonderful they respond because I have the worst case scenario in my brain thinking this is what's going to happen. Don't tell them, don't address this. But I would say 95% of the time, most people don't act like that and they give me these amazing responses where I'm like, wow, you're so understanding and you're so caring, and I'm not used to that. It's like, our brain is thinking the opposite. It's saying, don't do this. They're gonna, tear you apart, or they're gonna be mean to you. But most people are very understanding and rational. They're not crazy. They're not like an abuser would be.
It's the power of relational healing. That's why being in relationships is so important because, like, for me, like, the trauma got created in relationships and it will get healed in relationships. And a lot of the time, you're on the money in terms of, for me, like, growing up, like, the abusers constantly said, like, they were the best thing I was ever gonna get. And the more I do this work, the more I realize that they were the worst I ever got. And everybody else tends to be way better than them. And even if we run, or if I run into someone who was to act like the abusers, that still is giving me data in terms of, well, maybe I don't want to have that person in my life because that's not the reaction I want to get. Like, that's not what I want to experience every time I do conflict with somebody.
Yeah, and that's one thing that it can catch a lot of people up who grow up in abuse, is that a lot of times we can tend to be drawn to people who are like our abusers because we are familiar with that. And so it can kind of make it seem like, oh my God, everybody's like this, but it's not. And we just have to be aware of who does actually have the tendencies of the abuser. And a lot of it is, I would say, is self-centeredness. If someone is extremely self-centered, and I would also say demanding. So the person that where my complex PTSD comes from is an extremely demanding person, and I mean fist pounding on the counter, wanting things now, screaming, yelling. So whenever I see somebody who is really dark like that, like toxic, I just know, okay, stay away from them. And other people, sometimes I don't know that they see it. I think that they usually think that that person's a big baby, but I don't think that they actually know how harmful they can be. That's one thing I notice a lot is people tend to write them off as a spoiled brat, but they don't actually know this person is really harming their family. This person is really traumatizing their kid. We just have more heightened awareness because we have gone through trauma.
That's exactly right. And I think that also comes from waking up and seeing it for what it is. Because I don't want to say everybody out there has trauma. Like, that's not true. But I feel like a lot of people who might have experienced trauma, it gets normalized for them and it gets justified. And there's all these excuses. And it's like, oh, they just had a bad day, or, oh, well, they'll get over it, or, that's just how they are. And like those phrases can be so dangerous because it's essentially making it okay for someone to abuse somebody else. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations, and you have your podcast and I have my content, and there's an increase in people that are standing up and saying, wait a second, this is not okay.
Hmm. It can be something that really consumes your mind. That's I think a big problem of it. It can really consume your mind to where you're like, now if I do this, will I now be accepting this person into my life? Or if I do this, or if I say yes to go to this party and this person's there too, but I don't want to upset my friend and blah blah blah. Like it can really consume your whole mind. And that's one thing I think that what I call the cure for boredom. I think that that can help with that reading where you're getting your mind into facts and real information and getting out of the emotional thinking. Because I think it can just be very harmful to our brain to be so consumed by all of the thinking that we do because we don't want to enable abuse and we don't want to be abused because we've already been through it. For me personally, I've said this on my podcast before. I've had physical body paralysis twice, and both times, 100% they were related to my trauma. They were totally related. It was paralysis. I couldn't move muscles. And both times it was Bell's palsy. Doctors a lot of times don't really know what it is, but they give you I think they refer to it as a viral infection. But both times I had it was within 24 hours of extremely traumatizing events. So, I think it's just my body scared. My body got scared and it paralyzed me. I was so scared. We got to really check on our brains and do things that are going to get us out of all of the over emotional thinking and being, terrified. Um, and again, I think a lot of that is just saying what you will and won't put up with or who you will and won't talk to. And I've said on my podcast numerous times, I did stop talking to the people where my trauma came from. I went for like a year or two of not talking to them. And then I went back and I still do communicate with them, but I always tell people I don't recommend that because I think it creates a veil of blindness that you got to be real careful of because you're stepping back into a snake pit whenever you do recommunicate with certain people. And mine was just a personal decision that I'm surprised I did start talking to them again, but I always tell people I don't recommend that, particularly if you've ever been in and I haven't had this, but if you've ever been in like a marriage or something and it was physically abusive, I would say don't ever talk to them again. It just that's more than what I had because mine wasn't a marriage scenario. But that can happen a lot where I think that's even, I don't know if that's considered a syndrome, but like battered woman syndrome or something like that. I can't remember what that's called now. That type of thing. No, I always say don't communicate with that person for sure. But it can be a very slippery slope. Getting back to your point though, the we don't want to enable further abuse um, by normalizing something. So for me, mine was my high school math teacher, which I've talked about before. She was the only person to ever say, Ben, and I was 16 when she told me this. She was like, Ben, something is not normal in your house. It's not normal how these people are behaving, and the people who are treating you this way are not normal. She was very blunt about it. This is not normal. And she just happened to know things that most people didn't know, and I'm still so thankful that she spoke up and was 100% not afraid to say anything. She is the only person who ever said anything. It was my math teacher, and I just thought, man, that's I was very lucky to have her because if no one ever said anything and I never had her, I would just not even know if it was all real. But she saw it and she was like, "Oh yeah, this is totally abnormal." And I just think back, wow, I'm so lucky to have that person.
I'm glad you had that experience, and I do want to circle back around this, how complicated it can be in terms of talking to people that have been abusive to us or not talking to them, or like the hybrid style where there's a period of no contact and then there's contact that resumes. Like, it's so complicated because I was thinking about that person that got physically abused or abused in any way. So to me, like, any abuse can merit you setting the boundaries that you need. But like for somebody like that, if they have kids with that person and they have to co-parent with that person, that muddies the waters. Like, it's really complicated. And though I am no contact with my main abuser still, I recognize that like things change, and at one point I might be in the same situation that you are, where like even though I know that I feel better now without them in my life, in 5 years I might have to talk to these people again. And it can be so complicated, and it's a hard decision to make. And I know some boundaries might not be available for some people.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because there are some people who don't they can't do anything and it usually goes back to money. Just trying to get their own place. And getting your own address, having your own home, and having a job that where you can provide for yourself all by yourself. A lot of people can't do that. It's very hard. You would be working almost some people, depending on their background and this is the really sucky part is if you come from trauma, sometimes we do act out or sometimes we do get drunk and we go ballistic and then what do? We get in trouble. And then once you get in trouble, you get a record and then it's very hard to get a job because maybe you got arrested for something or and it's because you were acting out against your abuser or but then it hurts you. And so that's the really tricky part is just having that stable foundation to get away from them and not lose your mind in the process. That can be super, super tricky. Having I would say, a big support system of some sort is huge. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that. And for me, what actually ended up me talking to my abusers again was something like that. It was a scenario where I needed somewhere to live for a while and my job had been cut in 2018 and I tried for like 5 months to get something and I lived with a friend for a while and I had moved back to North Carolina. I was just out of money and I thought, what am I going to do? And then also a funeral. There was a funeral that I just could not miss and they were there and I thought, well, here I am, and here they are and it was a grandparent's funeral and I was like, well, I'm not gonna miss it because I used to spend a lot of time with them, but they were there too. So anything related to money, medical, and funerals, sometimes weddings. Weddings are a little different, but a funeral. Most people aren't going to skip a funeral just because there's someone there that they don't talk to. Funerals, medical, and money. Those three things can really be a monkey wrench, or whatever you want to call it.
They totally can be. And I feel like I want to say this out loud for anyone listening. Like, there's no right or wrong way about going about these scenarios. Like, I feel like if you go to the funeral or if you don't go to the funeral, like, it's almost like a lose-lose situation. Like, there's going to be pain
It
and suffering
is.
either way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're in this situation, like, do what feels right to you. Like, again, it's so complicated depending on the level of toxicity and who's going to be there. You know, you might be in danger, or you might be able to get through it with, you know, tons of boundaries and self-care, like before, during, and after you're on it, Ben. Like, usually finances, really big events tend to be where a survivor is just kind of cornered into making a really tough decision. All right, survivors, checking in. How are you feeling after part one? I hope you were able to get something useful from this conversation I've had so far with Ben. And I invite you to come back next week for part two, where Ben and I are going to be talking about his journey with sobriety, how he has found meaning in movies that feature characters that have survived trauma, a tool he has used to find joy, the importance of community, and so much more. In this week's healing invitation, I have been inspired by something that Ben shared, which is looking for something new to learn. Ben did this by going to a library and checking out a few books every couple of weeks. I invite you to get creative with this one. The whole point is to find something new. It can be a book. It can be watching a new movie you have not seen. Perhaps there's an activity going on in your community, and that could be a place for you to find something new. One way I used to do this was when I would walk, even if I was walking through the same trail or the same route, I would try to find something new during that particular walk. And it could be anything from a change in nature, the temperature, perhaps somebody had decorated their home differently for the season. The goal is to begin learning to pay attention to find new things, even in the stuff that we do every day. Please let me know how this week's healing invitation goes if you choose to accept it. Before we wrap up this episode, all music and production is courtesy of yours truly. Also, I want to share a few ways you can help support this podcast. You can subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the platform you are using to listen. Share this episode with anyone you think could benefit from listening to this podcast. Follow the podcast on Instagram at Hello Trauma Brain. Subscribe to the Hello Trauma Brain YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when I post a new episode. And you can make a donation via PayPal. I want to thank you in advance for your support. A little can go a very long way in helping the podcast reach more survivors that could benefit from finding this content. No worries. All links will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for joining me and Ben today. I hope you found this episode helpful. I wish you the best as you continue your healing journey. It is time for our farewell affirmations. I invite you to repeat after me. I welcome the belief that I am enough. I am lovable. And I deserve to heal. I wish you a gentle week and thank you for your presence.